Hello everyone! In the last video we did this project, which is a long time ago, to be honest. And what we learned was how to load files, create variables, functions and similar things in JavaScript with a project which allows us to learn things by doing it more quickly. But since we are all professionals or wanna be professionals soon, we need to learn many more things. I'm talking about databases, APIs or websites, and a better version of JavaScript. If you check the code, we wanted to have IntelliSense, and therefore we created this js.references types file. But what if I tell you there's a dedicated language which is built upon JavaScript to make it easier for typings? Yes, TypeScript was made by Microsoft, which works via JavaScript and Node.js and Dino and other runtimes to add types to your variables. Therefore, in this video, we're going to get started with TypeScript, with a database, and with a web server. For that, let's get right into it. On my desktop, I still have the example.1 folder, but I also have a new folder which is called TypeScript. In there, I just have a .env and an example.env file. I'm gonna drag this inside of my VS Code. Now it's open like that, and in the environment file, which is called .env, I have these properties. You don't need client ID and client secret for this video yet, just those two properties. Make sure to fill in your bot token and don't share it to others. And now we're ready to actually get started coding it, aka coding the new bot. But before we can do this, we need to initialize the project. How do you initialize a Node project? You type Node Package Manager init. With that, you can spam enter if you want, doesn't really matter. You can now create your package.json file. Now your project is initialized and your main file would be index.js. But we don't want to use index.js. Our main file is index.ts inside of a folder called source/index.ts. How did I do this so quickly? I'm going to show you. If you create a new file either with this icon or right-click new file, you can add a folder name or many folder names, and then in the end the file name and file extensions, which will create the file inside a subfolder. For this project we need several of libraries. First Disco.js, second Prisma, third add types express, then we also need add types node, we also need chalk and .env, we also need raw express and TypeScript, as well as tslint and tslint -config -prettier and prettier. Those are many things, yes. Disco.js is for a bot, Prisma is for a database, types express, types node, and express is for our web server. Chalk is for prettying up the console, and .env is for loading environment variables. TypeScript is to load TypeScript projects. tslint and prettier and this middle thing is for formatting and checking things. Now, first let's do a pretty simple console log hello world. And what would happen if we want to run this file? Well, we simply do node space dot, it works. Nothing changed, it works. It's a TypeScript file and we can run it. Amazing. But now the magic happens. If we create a normal function with a name and a property, and then we want to console log the property, and then we execute the function with, let's say, 2. It will say that our property, if you hover over it, has an any type, but a better type may invert from usage. Usually, TypeScript relies on typings. That means every variable has one specific or multiple specific types. We can create types by typing type, my type, aka the name of the type, equals string, number, or even examples like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Now, if we want to make sure that the property is only allowed to be my type, we now type double column my type. It will arrow up here and showing that the file is read to tell us there's something wrong. The function name allows the property only to be either 1, 2, 3 or the number 4. If we hover about it, it even tells us that. We now click Alt F8. Oops, doesn't work for me. But if we would click Alt F8, we would view more details about the problem. Now, if we type 2 in strings, it works. If we type 4 in strings, it doesn't work. But if we type 4 as a number, it works again. And now if we run the file, it says errored. Why? Because this is TypeScript specific functions, which allows you to force types in your project, leading to less error probabilities. As I explained in the first video, if you code correctly, you cannot get errors. But with TypeScript, you can enforce rules in your project to stop getting errors more often. And yes, there is a shortcut of adding type, creating a type and then adding it in here. We can directly type the possible types inside of here, like if we would create a variable for that. That's totally possible. If we want to allow all possible strings, we type string. And then only strings are possible. If we want to allow strings and numbers, we do string or number. But now, how do we execute it if it's not runnable with Node? Well, we need to build the project with TSC. TSC is a command line, MPX TSC, I think. Quick moment. Dot. TSC is a tool from the project TypeScript, which we installed. With that, we can build projects. But in order to do that, we need to configure our project first. That is possible with a file called tsconfig.json in the root folder. There we add JSON, aka only objects. First, the compiler options, which is our target. Most of us will always use a target ES2016 with lib, which we need for express, for something later, I will explain. As next async iterable. And model is common.js, which allows basically everything. Declaration to be true, and our output dir to be anything what we want. Let's call it out. It's often dist or lib, but I'm gonna call it out. And we also have our strict mode to be true. These are options for the compiler to tell it what rules to check. Now we declare what files it should check to compile to JavaScript. And then what files to not compile, which is in our case just node modules, aka exclude, yes. Then we also need another configuration, which I'm gonna copy paste now, which is for our linting, which checks the code for errors. And that's almost it. I also have a new project, which I have prepared for this file, which is called .prettierrc. What is prettier? This is totally optional. If you run a command with prettier, it formats the code so it looks pretty. That's it. Now we need to create our commands inside of our script, inside of our package.json, so we don't need to remember them. First, for our formatting, which is for our prettier, where we prettier execute the command prettier write source any folders, subfolders recursively with the file extension TypeScript. We also wanna create a second command called lint, which executes the command tslint with -p for the configuration file to check the project for errors. Then we wanna start the project with something I'm gonna show you later. And we wanna build the project, which is simply said a tsc command. Then we wanna make all double point build, which is npm run lint and npm run format and npm start. Yes, npm run start. Sorry, no, npm run build. And we copy paste this and call it just all for start, which we're going to use later. Now let's see what happens if we run npm run build. It will execute the command tsc, which will check tsconfig and create an out file with index.d.js and index.js. Now if we go in package.json and change our main from source index.ts to out index.js and run this, it will work. That's great. But there's also a way to not always compile the project and run the compiled version. This is called using tsnode. With tsnode, we need to install that first. We can execute TypeScript files like if we would execute Node.js files. So if we now run npm run start, it will execute our index.ts file, which works without generating the out project. And now I'm gonna show you all things you need to know for TypeScript. First things first. The types already covered. Now, how do you declare types? First, let's create a new type. Type Chris, yeah, equals hello or bye. Okay. Now we have const something equals get something. Okay. And now we create a function called get something, which returns hello. It works. But if we would type asd, it also kind of works. Because TypeScript just recognizes that it returns a string and not what it should return. Something should only be a Chris variable. How do we say TypeScript that something is only allowed to be Chris? Well, first we could type in front of something Chris. Now that would tell that it's not really working because get something returns a string. So now we need to tell get something to return only Chris allowed values, and now we need to return something which is allowed in Chris, aka hello. That would be it. But there's also a different way. We could also start, instead of typing a double point Chris here, a space after the declaration as Chris. It just tells that something is double point Chris. This is the old way, and what I showed you first is the shortcut. You can even make spaces in between if you want. For a function, that should be always done by this. However, if you don't want to have it in here, in the end of your return, you can also type as Chris. Good. Now that's for types. But can a type also be an object? Let's test that. Something hello. And now if we return that here, it works. But there's something better than an object for declaring object types. It's called interfaces. Now I'm going to call interface Chrissy, where I have something to be a string and hello to be a number. Now if we return in the function Chrissy, something can be a string, that's right, but we also need hello to be a number. Now we see here on something that it's Chrissy, because get something returns only Chrissy and something is overwritten by Chrissy. Via interfaces, you always declare types for objects. Simply said. Now you can extend interfaces. You can do many things, but I will not cover that because that's usually not needed by you if you code right. So now I'd say let's get started by rewriting our old project to TypeScript. I'm gonna get started by first is always declaring our environment variables via .env. So we import the config function from .env. That's it. Now we're gonna create a folder inside of our source which is called bot, because that's our bot. In our bot folder we wanna have our structures, utils, and whatever things we need. So structures, utils. In bot we also need commands and events, etc. etc. Commands and events we'll do later. In structures we're gonna create our client TS, and in utils we're gonna export our client options so that our client file is short. Also our bot TS needs an index TS, which you can also call bot TS if you want. Now if we go in the client, we're gonna import the client from Discord.js, and then we're gonna export a class, our bot, which extends the bot client. This does not only extend the type client, but also the class client. Now if we do a constructor, which we always need inside of a class, we now need to call super, which is needed for the client. But it yells at us that there are no options required. If we would code it in normal JS, it wouldn't tell me that, because it doesn't check for that. But TypeScript checks if the types are all valid. So now we need to provide the client options here, but I said we're gonna export them in that file. So we're gonna import activity type, etc. from Discord.js. Always type the object from, because then you get IntelliSense, which is option, which makes it faster, because if it's highlighted like that, just press tabulator and it auto completes for yourself. And we also need the options. Now we're gonna export function get client options. We could also just export an object, which I think is easier. Export const client options as client options object. Now we get equals object. Now we get IntelliSense. We can now do intents. We first just want our guilds intents. Then we can declare allowed mentions, for example, or shards or default presets. Let's do that. So let's set the status of do not disturb and activities of, let's say, name equals hello world, type equals activity type dot playing. Now, if you are a little bit advanced, you can add something called make cache. Now we're gonna cache everything. If you wanna limit your cache, cache with limits object, and then provide what you're not gonna wanna cache by doing make size 0. In this configuration, it wouldn't cache guild emojis. But to make it simpler, we're gonna cache everything at first. Now we're back in here. We're gonna type client options, and now we have all of our client options imported like that. Back on the client, we now need a utility function to log in. For that, we're gonna make a private async init function, where we're gonna do await this login with our process env this bot token. If you check your environment variable, bot token needs to be inserted. Then, once we are logged in, we're gonna console log logged in. If something went wrong, we're gonna console error the error. Now, if we run the start command, let's see what happens. Nothing. Because this file gets executed, it configures the .env, but never calls that the bot should be configured. So therefore, we now make a middleware to call the bot. This way, we can have multiple sub-projects inside of a big project, like a bot, a website, and a database. So now we're gonna import. We're gonna export a const init bot function, where we're gonna declare our client, which is our bot, so like that, and return that client. That's it. Now we go in here and we call initBot. Now if we run start, it should log in with our bot, and after a couple of seconds it's actually telling login, but it didn't. Why? The explanation is in here. If you check structures client, init is grayed out, aka dimmed. That's because we never called that function. If we now call the function here, I'm going to make a console logging in, then it will look like this. So now we execute npm run start, and it should tell us console logging in. And now it's logged in. And if we check our bot, it should say online with hello world and DND. That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Now, just to prove that you can still build the project and then execute the out project, I get the builded version. Let's try that with node space dot. It also says logging in and logged in, but this time it uses this compiled version, which you see is pretty interesting. Old JavaScript code, which always works. I'm gonna change up the console log so that we see that it's actually the out version. I'm gonna delete the out version again because we don't need it. Because we want to use our beautiful code. So now to show you what prettier etc. does, I change up the code ugly like that. And now if we run npm run all, it first runs lint to check if code has errors. If nothing appears, it's fine. Now it runs prettier, which goes over all files and formats it pretty in a standard pattern so that all files are formatted the same way, which is perfect for me. As you can see, it just did that automatically. There's a loading bar because it's still handling the deletion of the project. So now we need more. What do we need? This console log is not beautiful. I don't like it. I want to make a logger. For that, we need npm chalk and moment. Then we're going to create our logger, which is inside of a folder. Or actually, let's do the shortcut again. Util or utils logger.ts. And in there, we're going to now import everything as chalk from chalk. And import everything as moment from moment. Now we're gonna need our layers for our logger, which is, for example, info, which is error. The cool thing about TypeScript is it figures out what the types of the most things are automatically. So as you can see, it tells me that it's declared but never read, and it's everything with a key and a string. But if you want to enforce something, you can create an interface. Now we're going to export an interface called logger options. We want to have prefix to be optional, a string. We want to have a debug, which is a boolean. Now we want to copy that because we also have info, error, and success. And now we're going to create our logger, which is class logger. Now we make private options, which shall be logger options, which shall equal be on default a prefix of this or null, which is or undefined, which is the equal for not defined, but our default logger, let's call it logger on default, and everything on true. Now we're gonna create a constructor where we provide options as an option for the logger. So when you call the class, you can provide the logger options. Now we override these options with the provided options or with the default this.options if it's undefined. This means that these options are optional. But we don't want them optional because we want to have errors if we don't provide them. So let's change it up to how it was before. Now we're gonna create util functions. For example, private get day. This returns a day. For that, we're gonna use the beautiful library called moment, with which we can create something like this, which is the day, month, year, formatted for the current time. If you provide a timestamp in here, it will use the timestamp of that. You can also provide entire dates or even other moments. And you can then declare if it's 5 months ago, it will also format the time for that. Now we need another private function. Why does it say private? Well, if it's private, only the class itself can access it and no one else from outside. Well, from outside they can still access the function, but they don't get IntelliSense for that. Now we're gonna do the same, but for hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Now we're gonna create our first logger, which is info, where we have this function. It allows multiple strings, which I called input. Now we want to console log an array, which we then later join together with no spaces. This way we have it easier to format strings, and we're gonna use chalk. But as you can see, it doesn't really work. That's because chalk is on the current version 5. 5 is not working with TypeScript because it's ESM only, which would mean we need to change up the code. But we don't want to be that, so we're gonna import chalk 4. Now that chalk 4 is imported, we can do chalk gray. What does chalk do? It colors console outputs. First, we want to have the day simply with a gray tone. Now we want to have the time bold because the time is more important. The day is really just a sub information. Afterwards, we're gonna check if we have a prefix. If so, we're gonna style our prefix. Else, no string. Then we're gonna create a variable for this space because we want to have a space. For that, simply create a new private variable, call it space, and on it is a string, which the default value is chalk magenta bold. and I like to do this as a space. After that space, we're gonna do chalk cyan bold, and now we're gonna use strings info chalk cyan bold, something like this, to make a space between our input, which we're gonna flat and join. Now, what does this do? First, we're gonna show our current time, date, in a gray version. Then we're gonna show the current time, hours, minutes, in a gray version, but bold, aka thick. Then, if we have a prefix, we're gonna show it. Then we're gonna provide a space, and then we're gonna provide the logger information. For example, this one. And then we're gonna provide chalk and this thing, which is just like before information and then the logs. So it separates it a little bit, a separator. And then we're gonna show the inputs, which shall be strings only, in a dimmed version of the color, so it looks neat. I think that info is a cyan, which is a bluish color. So our strings, if we tab it right, we can see I typed it so that they are all the same length. So if you use a monospace code, a font in your terminal, which you normally do, it will always look the same length. Now we're gonna copy info. We should also return something in every function. Now we're gonna copy info, and now we're gonna call it error. On error though, the problem with error is you don't provide a string, you provide an error. So the option is now error, which is an error. And error is for me red. How do I edit multiple files, lines at once? I highlight the first one, press Ctrl D until I marked all I want, and then type. Now our string is error, of course, and we don't have an input anymore. We now have an error. Errors has properties, message, name, and stack. If a stack is available, then we want to do error stack. Else we want to do error.name, error.message. A stack is always structured with name, message, and then file informations. Now we want to filter this array for Boolean to make sure that we only show actual messages. We're going to map it and create everything to format everything to a string. And then we're going to join them together with a new line in between. That's for our error. We can copy info again and again. Now we're going to make our success, which for me is green, and change it up. And we're going to create a debug, which is for debug information, which is for my case gray. Now we also need to do, if this options debug is false, oops, I zoomed out accidentally, then we don't want to log it, because we only want to log it if the options say yes, aka log it. This we're going to repeat for all 4 log types. But now you're going to say, okay, neat. Let's test it. Yes, let's test it. We go back to init.bot, where we have our bot initialized, and now we need to declare a logger. So, public logger equals new logger prefix. Wait, import it. And now the prefix is bot. Perfect. Now instead of console log, we use this logger info, and logged in is this logger success, and error is this logger error. Now if we start it, why is it so slow? I don't know why it's so slow right now. We're gonna cancel it. Let's type it manually. MPX. Doesn't work. So now let's run lint. If there are any errors, variable name clashes with keyword type. Oh, we are not allowed to name it string. It should be strings, because string is the type string, and therefore we now deleted, destroyed TypeScript, I guess. That's why you need lint, that to prevent such errors. Now if we run start, why doesn't it work? Do I have something wrong? Struct is 4, moment is imported. Init bot. Ah, it works, but wait. Let's console log the options and see what options that the logger has. I assume that info is false and that's why it's gonna return. Yes, it's not provided because the default is not set. So we're gonna go back to here and add it. Now it's on default enabled. But you're gonna say, can't we just say, okay, on default it's true? Well, if you don't know something in TypeScript, which I don't know at the moment, Google TypeScript interface default value. How to set up a default value. Okay. Okay, this is too complex for me because I don't really like it. But what I see is they insert they do something like this. This dot options, which is our default, and then the normal options, which is the options the user provided, which overrides the things if they are provided. So now if we run, we should see that everything is true, even if we remove the options from here. And as you can see, the logger is beautiful. But now you should think, what if we want to log an array or something which is not a string? You are right. We can't log that with our logger. Because I want to have the opportunity to show the strings so beautifully with the colors, we want to redo our logger by copying everything, typing raw object, paste everything in, format that to callback functions, string functions like that, arrow double point, success double point, double point. And because I don't really know what value I'm going to insert when I log, because I'm going to allow anything, I'm going to type any. Arrow is arrow. We don't really need the arrow because arrow is normal. And instead of formatting the input, we're gonna just pass the input inside of the console log, which is what we need. So now we can log raw data. So if we are logged in, we can this logger raw info, this guilds cache map guild.name. which means if we run, it also displays the array of guild names. Like that, which is undefined because it's not really ready, but you get what I mean. Good. Now we go back to our logger and we're gonna delete the console log for the options because that's not needed. Now that's done. The bot is login able. We might wanna add the information logged in as client user tag or client user username, hashtag client user discriminator. Instead of client, we of course use this because this is our client. Now we're gonna ensure that the user is allowed because now it's a thing because it's not ready. And we want to make our username bold, so we're gonna do chalk dot, I don't know, white dot bold. Now we're gonna import chalk, so import start as chalk from chalk. And now we're gonna also do something like that on this thing. So chalk gray, and the discriminator chalk gray bold. So now if we run it, we see example bot hashtag 7377. So we should maybe do reset, chalk reset, so we clear that it's dimmed before. Now it's white and gray, and then green again. So here also chalk gray, that's okay. And here we need to reset, so it's, here we also need to reset. Good. Anyways, we now wanna have more things. We wanna create a database. To create a database, we need a new structure or a new file. I wanna have the database available for other projects like overutils, so I'm gonna create a data folder. And in the data folder, I'm gonna create a database folder. In the database folder, I'm gonna create a file called prisma.ts, where I'm gonna import Prisma client. Oh, we haven't declared Prisma yet, so npm Prisma. Now we're gonna do npx Prisma init. Prisma client from at prisma/client. Why doesn't that work? Oh, we're not done yet. So now that, since we now ran npx Prisma init, Prisma is generated. We want to move Prisma into data because that's where we have our database declared. I'm gonna use something called SQLite. So instead of PostgreSQL, I'm gonna use SQLite because that's the easiest to set up. File /dev.db. And now we create a model. For example, user Discord ID string at ID, and then we're going to create command users, which we're going to say int at, yeah, that's, it's okay like that. Yeah. And now we're gonna go in package, where we're gonna do Prisma and then schema or scheme. Schema. And then we're gonna do dot slash or no dot slash, just source data Prisma schema.prisma so that Prisma knows where its schema file is located at. And now if we run mpx prisma migrate def, ignore the VS Code errors, it creates a migration and we call it db. Now we have our database stored here, and now we can import Prisma client from Prisma/client and export class database, which extends Prisma client, where we have our constructor, where we call super, and that's it. Now we can add special features and utilities if we want, but we're now gonna use in our bot public db equals new database. That thing. Good. And now here we're gonna create a function called const test equals async callback function console log something, where we provide the client, which is our bot, and here we call test client. And now we're gonna do const res equals await client db find db user find many, and the result will be printed in the logger, which we can use client logger raw debug. Now if we run our bot again, we see the debug information here. Now if we want to create something in the database, for example client db user create, we can create something. Let's create something for me, where we have data to be our Discord ID and command users, which on default is 1. And if we wait for that to finish and then search the database and run, we should now see one object of Discord ID and command users in our res. As you can see in here, now we have a database entry. This is how we create one. So we know the database works, so we can delete test again, and our bot works. Now all that's left to do is add the command handler and the command loader and event loader, what we had before, and structure this logger success inside of the ready event. Just to show you how an error looks like, I'm gonna go here and make a wrong token so that executes. This is how the error looks like. Beautiful in my opinion. Good. So let's see how long the video is, 48 minutes. So instead of making the commands and event loader inside of this video, I'm gonna do this in another one with the extension of how to do a sub/command loader, which I had planned for this video, but I got asked if I could show to make a Discord bot in TypeScript. The reason we are using TS Node is, thanks to TS Node, we are able to declare a database, and if we would compile with TypeScript, it only compiles TypeScript files. It doesn't compile those migrations, nor the schema.prisma, nor the def.db, which is in here. This means it wouldn't move the folder within the out folder. This is not optional. This is not good. This means if you want to use a compiled version, instead of compiling it to out, I can show you what you can do. First thing what you should do is let me create a new test folder, copy everything except the node modules inside of there. Now if you open with Visual Studio Code here, so you can get a terminal, you change up the source to out, and you go in the tsconfig, and your out folder is your source folder. And now you only include source anything.ts, and you're gonna exclude anything.d.ts, because now if you're gonna run npm install first everything, now if you're gonna output something, this is source, obviously not out. Now if you're gonna build, it's gonna build its files inside of here, hopefully. Yes, and now we have d.ts files, which is needed for the normal JS files. If we run again, it shouldn't use the d.ts files because we excluded them. This way we can use the builded project. And now if you can all build, you can then node dot. So if you npm run all ;build instead of ts nodes, you can then completely remove ts node and this. It first checks for tslint and slint and pretty files, all of it, and then compiles it. Oh, and now we need to do npx prisma migrate def. So Prisma is generated. So we can now do node space dot, which it errored on. And now it works the same with a compiled version without ts node. So that's why I'd recommend you to use ts node, because it simplifies the compilation step, which is pretty neat for my opinion. So if you don't want to use ts node because ts node doesn't support ESM, that's why we need to use an older version of Chalk. So then you can solve it by compiling everything inside of the same folder to make Prisma work, or something you need which is not a TypeScript file. You can change the TypeScript config to also copy other files than just TS files, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would rather recommend doing that, so you don't have headaches if to think, did it just copy it with, or what's the new reference path? Do I need to declare out path instead of source path, etc., etc. That's the best solution. And see you in the next video.